back. WNST, Taos, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively through one day of draft. We got a couple more days to go, and we're going to be talking about late round picks and fourth round picks. Luke Jones is here, all of a courtesy of our friends at Wise Markets and the Wise conversations we like to have around here. Luke, I always tell people on draft day, for all of the mock drafts and all of the predictions and all the assumptions in some cases in regard to needs, they speak when on draft night when the trades are made and the value is there. They tell you how they feel about Hollywood Brown, and they tell you how they feel about Trevor Penning and about any of the players that are out there. It was a wild night to be a Ravens fan on Thursday night. Not as wild as Lamar Jackson, but sort of up there for strange nights for draft to trade back in. How are you, man? I know exhausted after week one or night one. We got 3 more days left, right? 2 more days left.
It's interesting. You mentioned the Lamar Jackson draft, and even after the Ravens selected Tyler Linderbaum at 25th, I still wasn't quite ready to just, turn to the Zoom with Kyle Hamilton and wait for Eric DaCosta and John Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz to come downstairs. We were back at the Ravens facility for the draft, first time in 3 years. So, a little different pace than doing these more virtual drafts the last couple of years. But I was still not expecting it, certainly, but still wondering, is there one last trick up their sleeve to move into the first round again in the way that they did with Lamar Jackson, where, everyone's thinking, okay, they draft Hayden Hurst, they're done, and suddenly the Ravens are on the clock and the entire direction of the franchise pivots in a matter of minutes from the longtime Joe Flacco era to the Lamar Jackson era. So not as crazy as that, not as dramatic as that, but as I'm writing at BaltimorePositive.com, I kind of sum up night one of the NFL draft for the Baltimore Ravens in 5 words: great value, but greater questions. And I think it speaks to the incredible value that they got with Kyle Hamilton, who it was an underwhelming 40-yard dash time away from maybe being a top 5 pick. That's how dynamic. I mean, a lot of comparisons to Derwin James, who once upon a time the Ravens coveted, and but weren't able to get him, and that was that Hayden Hurst year, moving back and missed out on him. And then Marquise Brown, certainly. I mean, Eric DaCosta. I mean, this wasn't just a case where the Ravens didn't like Marquise Brown. It was a case where, and a lot of what you hear as far as the conjecture, contract related, seeing what the market is, wondering about his happiness in the Ravens offense, and Greg Roman and all those questions that we've all had as outsiders, and you wonder how players feel about it, within the building or within their mind, let's say. But you have that a case where he clearly wanted out. Clearly, if he had a contract number in mind, something the Ravens weren't prepared to give him, especially with one more cheap year remaining, and then a rookie, a 5th-year option after that. So they move on from him. The value of the trade itself, you can't beat that. I mean, you're talking about a 23rd overall pick. The Ravens send their 100th and Marquise Brown. That's great value. There's no question about that. However, in the same way that you and I had this discussion a year ago about Orlando Brown, it does pose the question, you just created another need for yourself. And oh, by the way, you still need an edge rusher or 2. You still need corners. And there's still that question about Ronnie Stanley and offensive tackle and depth there. So the value was tremendous. But I think it would be disingenuous just to say, great draft, no questions asked, and wondering what happens from here. Now, as you pointed out, 2nd-round pick, 3rd-round pick, as they enter Friday night, and I'm not necessarily expecting, to your point, knowing trades, this is going to change again by the time someone's listening to this, quite possibly, but scheduled now 6 4th-round picks. Do they use a couple 4th-round picks, get back into the end of the 3rd round, that pick that they gave up to in the Marquise Brown trade? But they still have a lot of positions to address here. So I love the value, but as I was kind of talking about it with some other reporters in Owings Mills on late into the morning, early Friday morning, really, love the value, but the roster construction's a little messy right now. I mean, so many safeties, so many safeties. So you look at that, and you still have those other needs, and now you've created another need at wide receiver, and we'll see how the Ravens go there. I mean, I guess we couldn't go a full off season without talking about wide receivers, Nestor. I mean, it's something we talk about in this town. So, uh, all in all, a crazy night. Again, I'm not saying a bad night, but great value, but greater questions that I take away from the first night of the NFL draft, which was certainly entertaining. That we could say that much. We can all agree on that.
Let me say this about Hollywood Brown. They don't deal away first round draft picks much, but lately, right? I mean, Hayden Hurst, and they turn that into Dobbins, or however you would, say tit for tat and player for player. But in the case of giving away Hollywood Brown, we're working from a place of strength, right? We're working from a place finally where Joe Ortiz says you're not going to be, kidding around. You guys are going to ask me about wide receivers finally, and now all of a sudden, it really is whack-a-mole, right? Like, you've created a question mark in a place that, I mean, I think outside of Baltimore, people were like, well, who are the wide receivers? And I'm like, well, they've used ones and, a couple of the last few years on wide receivers. They're happy with whom they've taken. And in the case of Bateman, now you're really asking him to do a whole lot more. And in the case of Hollywood Brown, and I brought this up, and everybody's brought this up. I mean, it's no secret how close he and Lamar Jackson were.
Right.
We've spent so much time talking signability, and I don't know that I've ever seen two players. I mean, Flacco and Pitta, or I'm going through the history of quarterbacks and battery mates, or however you would say it. They were close as people, and when you saw one, you saw the other, always online, offline, anywhere. This is perplexing to me in that way, in the signability for Lamar and winnability for Lamar, and who's going to get the ball from Lamar, and what this offense is about in regard to passing and running, and what the ultimate goal is when Hollywood Brown was portrayed as the ultimate Lamar weapon, right? I mean, he was a guy that was going to get Lamar to the promised land because he was a first-round draft pick and he had special skills. I was a little shocked to see the Ravens fold that up, and in a lot of ways, but Eric knows what he's doing, and Lamar tweeted out, and WTF, and like all that, but it feels like they better have had that buttoned up internally in regard to the quarterback. I'm going to trust that they have it buttoned up, but you never know.
Right, and that's the part of this, and as much as I just did my 3-minute monologue on summarizing it, I've major failure in not pointing that out. And of course, I was going to get to that, but that has to be a huge part of this, right? I mean, you're talking about your franchise quarterback. You're talking about a guy who was his, by all accounts, best friend on the team. Not to say that he doesn't have other friends and he's not close with other guys. I mean, we've seen, perhaps one of the signs of this. And if you would recall, there were a couple months ago, Marquise Brown had scrubbed everything about the Ravens from his social media. I mean, we've seen other guys do this around the league. I don't know. It feels like, blocking someone on AIM, for something, my generation that grew up with AOL and instant messenger and all of that kind of stuff. But we had seen Lamar Jackson working out with Rashad Bateman on a few occasions. We'd seen that on social media, but we hadn't seen Marquise Brown with them. And that's not at all suggesting that a falling out, but clearly Marquise Brown was on his way out of Baltimore and had requested a trade. I point blank asked Eric late Friday night or late Thursday night if they had talked to Lamar Jackson because of Lamar's reaction. And Lamar did clarify the WTF tweet he said was not about Tyler Linderbaum. At the same time, look, you're a fifth-year veteran. Read the room a little bit when you're tweeting that, and that's coinciding with your center. Even if it's about Marquise Brown, even if it's about whatever else, people are going to interpret it a certain way. So, he's not completely off the hook with that specifically. But I found the answer to be interesting. And I'm going to read, I have the transcript right here. I'm going to read it. I asked point blank, did you get a chance to talk to Lamar to prepare him that the trade was coming? Given how close they are as friends, given the fact that this is his number one wide receiver. And let's not forget Mark Andrews is truly his top target. I mean, all-pro tight end, best tight end in the game last year. But the answer was from Eric, yes, that's something we did do. John and I did speak with Lamar. We always do. Lamar is probably one of the great leaders of our team, also in the community as a teammate and in the building. So we do try to communicate with him as best as possible. We had a communication with him actually before the trade was made, to be honest, and explain the situation as best as we could. It's challenging for everybody. Our locker room is very close, which I'm proud of, as coach would say. So anytime a team is potentially, or anytime a teammate is potentially getting traded, it's something that's hard for the players to understand at times, but in the end, it happens. It's part of the business. So I found it interesting that right off the bat, he's complimenting Lamar's leadership ability and things of that nature, but at no point in that answer did he say, Lamar, we came to an understanding. We're on the same page. Lamar completely understands. So, he kind of left it open that there could be a little bit of frustration there. Now, I'm not suggesting that there definitely is or that there's a rift or anything like that. But, you look at this and this is where if you want to be a little more, I don't know if cynical is the right word, but I think it'd be fair to ask the question. We talk so much about culture and the building and the locker room and how much continuity they've had. And look, those are all very valid. However, can we ignore the fact that now 3 straight years they've had a relatively high draft pick on the offensive side of the ball request to trade? Hayden Hurst 2 years ago, Orlando Brown last year, and now Marquise Brown this year. Now, each of those situations in isolation, you can explain it. Hayden Hurst was very clearly behind Mark Andrews in the pecking order, and he understands what that means for his career and his long-term earning potential. Last year, Orlando Brown wanted to be a left tackle, and we know his backstory with his father, although I know you and I have talked about it at the time and have talked about it since then. There's certainly a major financial element to that. Marquise Brown, I'm assuming a big part of this was the Ravens' style of offense and what that means for his numbers and what that means for his earning potential, and seeing the wide receiver market since a trade request absolutely blow up. What does that look like in Baltimore? Were the Ravens ever going to acquiesce and pay him what could be $20 million a year? I'm guessing not. At the same time, there's still that question of what does it mean for your football team right now? So I think it's at least fair to pose the question, why are if the culture is truly amazing and so great, and I'm not saying it's bad, let's be clear, but if it is that special, that great, that amazing, the locker room's that tight, everyone's on the same page, they are having, they've had a few young guys now ask for trades. So it's just, I think it's fair to at least acknowledge it. And again, the value they got was tremendous. However, you still have to look at it in terms of the long term, which I think these moves put them in excellent position from a long-term standpoint. But did I come out of Thursday night thinking the Ravens are necessarily better for the 2022 season? I'm not so sure about that. In the same way that I said the same thing to you when they traded Orlando Brown, saying, look, I get the value, and you weren't going to sign him long-term after you had just signed Ronnie Stanley, but are they a better team for 2021? And we kind of saw how that played out. And their backup plan, Alejandro Villanueva, that wasn't so good. So long way to go.
Well, the backup plan here would have been Sammy Watkins, right? Or like that. And
yeah,
they're now, as you look at the depth chart, and by the way, Luke, we're going to talk about the kid at center. We're going to talk about the safety. We're talking about all that. But what is the depth chart in the room right now, wide receiver, and how is that going to be dramatically different by August? And you mentioned the cost of wide receivers. We've talked so much about the cost of quarterbacks, right? But what is the cost of entering a season with, and you can say what you want about Bateman, it was fine. Last year, rookie year, didn't even work with Lamar at the end of the year, didn't work with Lamar at the beginning of the year because he didn't work at the beginning of the year, right? That you look at the depth chart now and say, we already are pretty suspect of Lamar throwing the ball in general or how much he should be throwing the ball. Now it's, once again, same question we had 2-3 years ago. Same question we had the night we drafted Hollywood Brown, which is, who's he going to throw the ball to?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, Mark Andrews, obviously. I mean, that's a huge piece of this puzzle, and it's different than your typical tight end. I mean, let's clear that up. In the same way that Travis Kelce, you speak of him in the same way in Kansas City, and you speak of George Kittle in the same way in San Francisco. So that's obviously a huge part of this, was going to be a huge part of this, whether Marquise Brown was still here in Baltimore in 2022 or not. Rashad Bateman clearly moves up the depth chart. He's now your number one receiver. I like Rashad Bateman a lot. I saw a lot from him to like, given how difficult the circumstances were, given the fact that he was catching passes from Tyler Huntley and even Josh Johnson in Cincinnati. So I'm okay with that. But again, if we're continuing to talk about taking the next step, this passing game taking another step forward, you've clearly taken a big element. And look, I know Marquise Brown was not a perfect wide receiver. I was frustrated by the drops at times as much as anyone. Didn't offer as much in terms of yards after the catch as I would have liked to have seen. But still a guy who caught what, 90 some balls for 1,000 yards this past year. Clearly a major decline in the second half of the season. I think Lamar not being out there was a big part of that. It'd be silly not to recognize that. But I'll also throw this out because I think we have a tendency whenever you move on from a player as fans, I think it's to poke holes and kind of say, well, that guy wasn't that good anyway. Keep in mind, who was their best receiver, in, albeit not a whole lot of success in the playoffs, but Marquise Brown was the best player on the field in that playoff loss to the Titans, a few years back. He was big in that playoff win over the Titans the following year. So, even in the Buffalo game, made some plays in that loss. So this is a guy who had actually come up pretty big in some postseason situations that not many players on either side of the ball really had, if we're being perfectly honest. So my point is not that I was certainly going to be endorsing paying him $20 million a year or $18 million per year or whatever the Arizona Cardinals ultimately end up paying him. But I'll go all the way back to Torrey Smith, way back when the Ravens waved goodbye to Torrey Smith and he went to San Francisco. And let's face it, never lived up to his contract there. And we kind of know that Torrey, as much as we love him here in Baltimore, as much as he was awesome on the Ravens on his rookie contract with the Ravens, a big reason why they won a Super Bowl, but we knew he had limitations. But you still have to replace the guy at the end of the day. And it goes back to what you just asked me about the depth chart. Rashad Bateman, great. But if you're going to tell me that Devin Duvernay or James Prochet or Tylan Wallace are going to be the starting receiver opposite Rashad Bateman, I'm not picking up what you're putting down right there. It's just I'm not convinced about that. I'm not saying that those guys can't be a bigger part of what you do, but my question is, something has to be coming here, whether it's, and it might be as simple as, I'll give you a name, and maybe the Ravens don't even get a chance to draft this guy in the second round, but I'll give you a name, Sky Moore from Western Michigan. Go look at his profile, really shifty, undersized guy, but I've seen analytics people really like him. He's a great change of direction guy. He's got big hands, and he's someone that isn't going to be the same in terms of straight line speed as Marquise Brown, but I could see him filling a similar role otherwise. So that's one example. There are other talented wide receivers in this draft, but I'll kind of come back to a prevailing theme for this organization. You've taken plenty of swings at wide receivers over the years, and it hasn't always worked out very well. So I'm not going to say Marquise Brown was a home run, but he wasn't Travis Taylor. He wasn't Brashad Perriman. He was better than Mark Clayton ever was in this Ravens offense. So, again, it is a case of still have that need at edge, still have that need at corner, still have, I think, a need of depth at offensive tackle with the Ronnie Stanley situation. And now you have wide receiver that you look at all those needs, and I don't care how many fourth-round picks you have. I don't care second or third-round pick. You can't look at all those needs and think, there's got to be a veteran added there at one of those spots at the very least, a legitimate veteran. So we'll see how it plays out. And I know Eric used a line that Ozzie Newsome always used over the years. Oftentimes being asked about wide receiver this time of year, he would say, we don't play any games until September, which is true. But that's where I look at this and say, look, great value in the first round. I want to continue to emphasize that. I really like Kyle Hamilton as a player. I think he's very unique at the safety position. I mean, my goodness, look at, he's 6'4". That alone, 6'4", 220 at the safety position. I think you're going to see him play a lot of nickel. I think you're going to see him play some nickel linebacker even. I think, certainly they can use plenty of three safety looks when you look at the depth chart. And, they, oh, yeah, spent a bunch of money on Marcus Williams. And they still have Chuck Clark, and they still have Brandon Stevens, and they still have Tony Jefferson if he makes the roster, and they still have Geno Stone if he makes the roster. So plenty of options there, and plenty of ways you can use Kyle Hamilton. The interesting one for me is Tyler Linderbaum, though, because you and I have talked about this. They haven't valued the center position in so long. It has been late round picks and watching guys walk out the door and undrafted free agents like Matt Skura and Patrick McCary. For the Ravens to use the 25th overall pick on Tyler Linderbaum, knowing that he's a little undersized compared to how they've typically wanted their safeties to be, and knowing he's been more of a zone blocker compared to their gap scheme, it really makes me wonder if we're going to see some changes in that regard. But it also suggests they think this guy isn't just going to be a good starter. They have to be thinking to draft a center, and knowing positional value and the way that they look at those types of things from an analytics standpoint, they have to be thinking Tyler Linderbaum is going to be an all-pro center, because otherwise the value wouldn't make sense to do what they did there. Especially with the other needs that they had and other players that were available. That tells you how much they loved the player, and they think he's going to be that special, in the same way that you normally wouldn't pay a kicker the way they pay Justin Tucker, but he's quite possibly the greatest kicker in NFL history. That's a little bit different then. Positional value goes out the window a little bit then. So that one was fascinating, because I thought all along, scheme fit and size-wise, and just knowing how they hadn't valued the center position. I mean, last time they'd even drafted a center in the 4th round was Gino Gradkowski a decade ago. So all of those factors, and to come away with Tyler Linderbaum, shows you they love the player, and they think he's going to be an all-pro. Because if they don't, it wouldn't have really made that much sense, because they did have Patrick McCary, and there are some other options day 2, early day 3 of centers that certainly weren't going to be day 1 starters, but guys that could compete and grow into a starting job. So I just found that to be fascinating. Whereas Kyle Hamilton was very much the epitome, even though it's a cliche and we know that it doesn't always apply because you're always looking at need, but Kyle Hamilton was absolutely the example of best player available. And Eric even said it, that he didn't think in a million years that Hamilton would be there when they picked at 14th, and thought he'd be off the board in the first 4 or 5 picks. So I guess you can chalk it up. Thank an underwhelming 40-yard dash time, but everything else about that guy screams a chance to be a really special player in the secondary.
Luke Jones is here talking all things draft. Of course, you can follow Luke at Baltimore Luke. The WNST Tech Service, alive and well, brought to life by our friends at Coons Baltimore Ford, and trades and moves and an exciting evening. I would say this on the picks: safety and center, very unsexy picks in regard to where on the football field you spend money, or traditionally would say there's value. They're both positions you and I have talked about. Certainly the secondary in general has been going on for a decade, right? And the amount of safeties that they've drafted, from the Matt Elams and the Terrence Brookses to the Michael Goffs, the people they've signed over the course of years to play that position. Tony Jefferson, they gave a lot of money to as a free agent. But these are two players who were sort of clearly the best players at that position, right? They took top of class, team captain kind of, guys at these positions as first round picks. It's a very, very unique haul to say, well, they began the night with 1 draft pick and they ended the night with 2 first round draft picks, and they used it on safety and center. It's one of the primary questions we sit around here for sports radio in 27 years and ask, as well as when you're doing mock drafts, which is it a need? Is it a need? And is that the best player on the board? And why would they take a safety in the first round? Why would they take a center in the first round? Hey, a couple guards went off the board in the first round too. You talk about strange valuation, and the cornerbacks and the wide receivers, as I tweeted early in the night, it's skill kills, right? Like that you want that wide receiver and cornerback thing that we talk so much about, explosive plays. all of the analytics value all of these things, and yet for the Ravens, Captain Analytics, Eric DaCosta, he goes with a safety and goes with a center. That's just a unique combination of having 2 first-round draft picks to say where are their needs, what are they going to draft for, and in the end, this is an unsexy first-round pick, a series of picks, but they took the 2 best players at those positions. That usually works out well. That usually works out to mean if a guy stays healthy in this system specifically, that you're expecting these guys to be Pro Bowl players. And I know Eric's taken some heat, I think, from the fan base the last couple of years. I know when I get together with Moeller and talk about this, who's their star player beyond Lamar? I mean, Mark Andrews, fine. You could say Marlon Humphrey, but how many great players do they have? And if this Kyle Hamilton kid turns out to be Ed Reed, or and again, we talked about them going out to Seattle and bringing in, a guy who was a little bit of a malcontent, but he was a guy who was thought to be the best safety in the game for a minute, right? Or a couple of minutes, actually. I don't want to be disrespectful to him because it didn't work out here, but they're expecting to have the best center and the best safety in the game 3 years from now. They expect that to be the case. Maybe quicker than that with this kid Hamilton, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, and obviously, let's not forget Marcus Williams. They gave a $70 million contract to. So, you mentioned the analytics part. You mentioned positional value. I mean, that's one thing. Safety, we're seeing a shift, and clearly the Ravens. I don't think they had any expectation whatsoever. As much as you don't believe what a GM or a coach is necessarily going to say, because everyone loves their players, right? Even if you hate your board, even if things don't go the way you want them to, and you come away with a guy that you would have rather traded back or traded up to take someone else, you lie about it, right? But I do sincerely believe that they didn't have any expectation that Kyle Hamilton was going to be there. So it does present a very unique opportunity for them. I think, as I mentioned, I think you're going to see them play a lot more 3 safety, even nickel package, because if you look, Kyle Hamilton played a heck of a lot of nickel at Notre Dame. So, this isn't a guy that, in the same way that you look at Marcus Williams as more of a deep center field prototypical free safety, Hamilton was a guy that moved around a lot. And as he should at 6'4", 220 pounds, I want that guy playing at least some of the time closer to the line of scrimmage, right? I mean, you got a guy who can tackle, can stick, and cover tight ends and all those different things. So so I think the safety piece of this very much is in line with some new waves of thinking. I know Pro Football Focus has even talked about you're seeing more and more too high safety kind of defense around the league, and I think you'll see more of that most likely with Mike Macdonald as the defensive coordinator. But they're going to do a lot of stuff, and they're going to move Hamilton around a lot. And you still have Chuck Clark. This certainly wasn't a great night for Chuck Clark in a big picture sense, most likely. I would think his days probably are numbered if we're being realistic about it beyond this season. But in the meantime, boy, you got a lot of things you can do there. And one thing I think I do take away from this, and I want to try to get some clarity, even though I'm not so sure the Ravens will be forthcoming about it, but I do wonder if Brandon Stevens moves back to corner where he played in college, and he kind of works out as a corner almost exclusively now because you have 3 safeties. And that's not even counting Geno Stone and Tony Jefferson and even Ardarius Washington. So they have so many safeties. I mean, that's why you looked at this from a need standpoint. Clearly wasn't a need, but they saw a very unique opportunity with a very unique center. I mean, a 6'4" safety. I mean, Derwin James is 6'2", I believe. I think back to Sean Taylor, the late Sean Taylor, and all the potential he had in Washington and how big he was. I mean, he looked like a linebacker playing safety. It's very unique.
When that kid stood up in the green room and walked out, the first thing I thought was he looks like a power forward. I mean,
he's huge,
like a huge man. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just he looks like more of a tight end or like a Calvin Johnson kind of wide receiver. That's what he looks like. So again, you can use him as a chess piece in a lot of different ways, but it's unique. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But the center thing, again, from an analytics standpoint, it's not a position that's highly valued. And that's how the Ravens have operated over the last decade. I mean, again, go back. I went through and listed all the centers that the Ravens have drafted over their history. Bradley Bozeman, 6th round in 2018. John Urschel, 5th round in 2014. Ryan Jensen, 6th round in 2013. I already mentioned Gino Gradkowski in the 4th round. The earliest they had drafted a center was kind of sort of Chris Chester in the 2nd round in 2006, although he ended up playing way more guard. Jason Brown was a 4th round pick in 2005. Casey Raybach, 3rd round all the way back in 2001. So they've never drafted a center in the 1st round. The positional value says that's not a position you're going to look to draft someone in the 1st round. That is why I continue to come back to it's not that they think this is a good player. It's not that they think, oh, he was the best center in this class, because the best center in the class every year in the draft isn't a Pro Bowl player, right? There's only one Pro Bowl player or one Pro Bowl center from each conference, or 2 from each conference every year. So it's not just the best center in that draft class is going to be a Pro Bowl talent. This told me, taking him where they did, 25th overall in the 1st round, that they think this guy's going to be an All-Pro. Because if he's not, the value doesn't make sense.
I was going to say they think he's Matt Burke or Dermontti Dawson.
Correct.
They think he's a real difference maker. Yeah.
Correct. And I'm not saying Pro Football Focus is gospel, but looking at, they do player comps, and I know some people don't like player comps, and I know a member of the media even asked, and they weren't saying that Kyle Hamilton's going to be Ed Reed, but they made a comparison there, and it's just like, you can't compare anyone to Ed Reed, and Ed Reed was 5'11", Kyle Hamilton's 6'4", so there's not really a comparison as far as their build. But I did see Pro Football Focus compare Tyler Linderbaum to Jason Kelce, the longtime center of the Eagles, who he's a little squattier than the kind of center the Ravens have played over the last 10 years. I mean, think about it. Most of their centers have been guys. Ryan Jensen was a tackle in college. You look at some of these guys that they've played at center, they're bigger guys. So with Linderbaum coming in at 6'2" and listed at 305 and played a little lighter than that at Iowa, he kind of has to be a center. He's not big enough to go to guard, and certainly not big enough to go out to tackle. So he's a center. So everything about that pick and everything that that we understand from positional value standpoint, and even how the Ravens have operated, just tells you they think they just drafted a guy who's going to be the best center in the AFC. Probably not this year, but they think over the life of his contract and beyond, he's going to be an all-pro center, because otherwise it doesn't make much sense, especially with their other needs, especially with other players that were on the board, that you're going to take him, because there are some questions again, and that's what's going to be interesting in terms of what this might mean for the offense and their running game. He was more of a zone blocker, and they've been more gap scheme. So do we see a little bit of a pivot there, a little bit of a shift there to take advantage of a guy they think is a really special talent at what he does? Do we see a little more zone blocking, which Greg Roman, he has a multiple, as much as we can poke holes and ask questions about the passing game, he has a very multiple running game. We've seen that. And we've seen different types of running backs and different types of plays, and seeing Mark Ingram do what he did, and then J.K. Dobbins motioning from the slot and taking handoffs, a year later. So there's plenty they can do. So I will be interested to see if the Linderbaum pick does signal that you will see some. I don't know if I don't know if it would be a case where philosophically you're changing dramatically, but from a scheme standpoint, I think you could see some shifting there, because there have been some questions. What would Linderbaum look like if it's more gap, and something that typically you would say you're looking for bigger, more powerful guys. But Joe Ortiz also said he played a lot bigger and a lot stronger than his size indicates. So ultimately, you go back to the tape, and they clearly loved what they saw of him at Iowa, which, oh, by the way, way back when, another former Iowa offensive lineman worked out pretty well here for a long time in Marshall Yonda.
Well, they also have the inroads to Kirk Ferentz all these years later.
Correct.
Out there to know what's going on as well.
Correct.
All right, we'll break at this point because we're going to have more picks, more players, more things to talk about. Obviously, Kyle Hamilton, Tyler Linderbaum. We're learning names. We'll get numbers. There'll be more names. There'll be 4th-round picks all day on Saturday, from what I can tell. You can follow Luke at Baltimore Luke, and, of course, find us out at BaltimorePositive.com. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking draft, Ravens football, springtime, and BaltimorePositive.com.